what we're going to talk about next is just, I think, a checklist, if I'm correct. Yeah, checklist. So it's just kind of the kinds of things he's talking about, which is things that have been throughout the series, which is the data actually accurate? That's where you go to Snopes or PolitiFact or, one of those people to see, or Wikipedia, you do lateral reading. Is the data relevant to the point being made? I think that one is really key. And that one's harder to do, especially if you're just kind of skimming. Is the source reliable, and is the information being presented in a way that's honest about its conclusions? Have you guys run into that, where you've seen something in a way that the data isn't being presented honestly? And you want to give an example, for example. That's encouraging someone other than moi to talk, or not.
I have to think about how much they talk about voter fraud, and how, when you look at it, it really is almost non-existent. But they make it sound like it's everywhere, and and they don't really point to any evidence to support that.
I think that is really a good one. I think voter fraud is something that we do need to think about, ways to countering the narratives that are there. I think one of the first ways to counter it is to make sure that we are operating using the same definition of what voter fraud is. And asking somebody, what do you think voter fraud is? Yeah. Because that may or may not be what's in the law in your particular state. And that's one of the problems, and voter fraud is a really good example. Since voter law is made in each state, and it is different from state to state, what is actually considered voter fraud may be different from state to state. And it's one of the areas where, if we have people who are arguing with us, say on the internet, it's also good to know what they're talking about. So why, I mean, I know that, I'm not sure how many of you do a lot of sharing on social media, or sharing, for example, in presentations, but why and when do you share, and just how do you use infographics?
I don't think I've really used them, Catherine.
Well, Ashley Ann, you do infographics a lot. So that's, I was expecting you to go, well, because when you make presentations, you often think of graphic ways of doing it.
Yeah, but they're not infographics necessarily that are presenting data. Sometimes, mostly it's just a graphic to add interest to the slide. It's not a, creating a table or a chart or anything. I'm trying to think.
But if, let's say we wanted to create a chart regarding, regarding how many more people are voting in primary elections now versus 4 years ago due to the efforts of the League of Women Voters. Well, you can't actually, we don't have the data behind that, but you could say, what is the increase? Because that's going to show an increase. The question then would be, could you create a graphic that said, because more people voted in the primary, there were more upsets? That would be an interesting graphic. If we could find the data for that, we could make a whole article around that. And I would be thrilled to see that, even if the upsets didn't go in a way that I wanted it to, because I want people to vote in primaries. But so that shows that I want to kind of sort of like John putting Squarespace logo up there so that he gets the money for that every time it shows up. That was my, do I have an honest reason behind the graphic? That's where you have to kind of do something. So does anybody else use graphics frequently with, go ahead, Mary.
Well, this is, I do use graphics quite a bit, because one of the things I do, especially for the League, is I work on voter registration. So thus your example pinged my heart. But I've also, this year, I've been focusing on redistricting, which is a sufficiently complex data-based process that graphics are often necessary in order to convey the concept without an incredibly deep dive into the mathematics, which oftentimes the deep dive into the mathematics is really, really good for some audiences, but not so much for others. So graphics help in instances like that when you've got something that's very complex, but that also lends itself to relatively simple demonstrations, like sort of the classic, we've got 20 voters, we're going to divide them into 5 districts. That's 4 voters per district, and you draw little lines. That's something that I think conveys, without a dive into the complexity, what redistricting is about, as an example. But one of the question that came to my mind when you cited an example of, you know, more voters being registered may have turned the result of the primary, I think is what the example was, is what kind of backup would you have or would you need to show that as causation rather than simple correlation?
And that's a really good point. And to a certain extent, that was sort of an underlying thing that I hadn't actually said, but the whole issue of causation versus correlation is really critical in it. I would think that it would have to be, it would almost have to be done in a state where you registered by party, or, I mean, the only way, I don't know how you would do it. And I think we don't collect data like that to make that sense, you know, but it would make our work feel like, oh, because we did all this work and we registered voters and we got people out to vote, then it would change. But I will say that in Clark County, which was the county I was in when I was doing this particular, so I know this data set, in Clark County in 20, whatever it would be analogous to this year. So like in an off-year election, only 19% of registered voters voted in that particular election cycle. And at that point, about 25% of the county was not registered, which meant that the actual number of people voting in that election was maybe around 11%, 12%. I can't remember the exact figure. So you couldn't do correlation, but what happens if in the next off-year election, 30% of registered voters voted and with the same number of people unregistered? You could look at the outcomes and see if there was a difference because, you know, more people voted. Maybe, maybe not, but it would be interesting. But you could present that data in a chart. In fact, that's how I did present the data, just to show how many people. The question is what makes a difference in increase in, yeah. So, but it's one of those things. Has anybody caught something super outrageous that we want to like pay attention to, like a graphic? You can always send that outrageous example in to us and we will post it. An example of an egregious chart that you know you've seen in the wild. So we also want to spark conversation on our website and other things. So I think where we came from for today's is that the thing that we want to do is that the use of infographics and big data have become even more popular as our attention span, which they have done studies on, has waned. The other thing that in graduate school, when I was studying, doing scientific and technical writing, is that if you include a number in something, people think because that number is there, that there's something more important about that data. The fact that sometimes the anecdotal data is actually more valid, or more valid, is another thing. The other thing I'd like to say is that the point that John made about those students, where 40% of them would have used those numbers, what he didn't talk about is something that I like to talk about, is that 60% of the students did not say that. And if you're talking about middle schoolers and 60% of middle schoolers were able to figure that out, that seems to be something to, if you don't celebrate it, at least be happy that the percentages were not reversed. So it's why to think about that. So next time, what we're going to be talking about is click restraint, which is, I see this, it's interesting, it spark something in me and I'm just going to send it on. And so click restraint is one of those things that I use my social media accounts both to listen to bubbles that I don't exist in. So I listen to lots of people. But when I post, I try to post constructively things that I want to pass on and to be a good and effective digital publisher, which is what happens. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. And I really thank you for joining us today on our Kittitas website. You can get links to everything on our YouTube channel. Again, all of these episodes are being stored there. To continue the discussion, we're on all the social media platforms you could probably want. There'll be links to the slides in our blog. And please share the takeaways from today's session with your friends and family, because together we can chip away at misinformation and disinformation through our actions. And I want to thank you all for coming. So these are the takeaways. I'm going to make that big for today. Context, do the supports the claim? Data is accurate and relevant to the claim? I think it's important to do this. And thank you for joining us. I can hang out for another 5 or so minutes if people want to chat, but we're going to stop the recording at this time.